So they go in firing, and they, in about a 10 or 15-minute period, they shoot a lot of people, which turn out to be civilians. And then they finally get into the village, and it's very clear at that point that there are no VC in this village, or at least if there are, they're hiding. And again, that's another point at which that should have been it. We're done now. And in a way, it was. Medina, who was the head of a C company that had assaulted My Lai 4, he issues a report, and this is where the cover-up starts, that says he's already killed 20-some VC. He knew they weren't VC. I mean, we have it in the record. He radios back these reports. Yeah, contact made. We killed 20 VC. I got the bodies, so on and so forth, and we're going to proceed through the village. So he's already lying. And Barker already knows there's something just not right about it. I mean, it clearly isn't what they expected. So at this point, Medina and Barker and a couple of other people start to collude, essentially to hide what's going on. And we're only 10 minutes into the operation. At that point, Medina says, okay, hold your fire. Let's gather the civilians up into groups and get them out of the village so we can move through the village, because we have another objective past the village. And so that's what he orders Callie to do. Get them into groups, get them out of the village, we'll search the village, and then we'll move on to our next objective, which is to the north. And Callie does this. And then something really inexplicable happens. Callie orders his men to kill the civilians in these groups.
In November 1969, news broke of a massacre of Vietnamese civilians by US troops in the village of My Lai in the So Tonh district of Kwang Nai in the south-central coast region of Vietnam. The killings themselves had taken place more than a year earlier on the 16th of March 1968. It's difficult to know how many deaths there were. The US Army puts the figure at between 150 and 347, and there are estimates of around 500. By March 1968, the war in Vietnam had not been going well for the US. Numbers of killed by the end of that year reached nearly 37,000. The total US killed in Vietnam would reach more than 58,000. Including civilians, South Vietnam would see 1.2 million dead, and North Vietnam would lose around 1.5 million. And so these numbers are mind-boggling. The US and South Vietnamese forces faced two enemies. First was the North Vietnamese Army, or the People's Army of North Vietnam, which was a more conventional force based predominantly in the north, but also in Laos along the supply lines of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the other was the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, which was a guerrilla force based beyond the demilitarized zone in South Vietnam. Americans had seen increasing involvement in Vietnam throughout the mid-60s, and the numbers of troops increased considerably, so that by 1969 more than 500,000 were in the country, under the command of General William Westmoreland. But the message being given to the American people was that victory was right around the corner. Just prior to the massacre in January 1968, the Tet Offensive took place, which was a massive attack by North Vietnamese forces, and in the south, Viet Cong forces managed to breach the US Embassy grounds in Saigon. That attack, whilst unsuccessful, showed the American public that perhaps the war wasn't going well. So there's the background. My guest today is Marshall Poe, who has written The Reality of the My Lai Massacre, which is unique in that it examines the events of that day to try to understand exactly what happened. Marshall is a historian and author of books on Russian history and is the founder of the New Books Network, a podcast that covers many different subjects, including history, so links are in the show notes for you to find out more. Coming up, I've got Winston Churchill, the history of conspiracies, a debate on SAS origins between two historians who don't see eye to eye, the Gothic Wars, and much, much more. Please do share with like-minded and rate and review if you can, but until then, I'm going to hand you over to me talking with Marshall Poe on the My Lai Massacre. Marshall Poe, welcome. It's absolutely fantastic to have you on. We're here to talk about your new book, The Reality of the My Lai Massacre and the Myth of the Vietnam War. And so thank you for joining me.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And so this is a subject, actually, for the listeners. I've not really delved into the Vietnam War at all. We've spoken a little bit about JFK and
the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happens around about the time of the beginning of the US involvement in the war. But the My Lai Massacre, which occurs in March of 68, is what we're here to talk about today. And this is an atrocity that occurred well into US involvement in Vietnam. And so I wanted to start by just asking if you could provide a little bit of context for our listeners, just so they know what's happening during the Vietnam War when this massacre occurs. And then we'll deal what happened and why.
Okay, so it's probably best to begin in 1965 after the Tonkin Gulf incident. And this was the point at which the Johnson administration, which had already been involved in the Vietnam conflict, as had the Kennedy administration, decided to send a lot of U.S. troops there very quickly. They were quite worried that South Vietnam would fall. They did not want South Vietnam to fall for various reasons, some of them having to do with geopolitics in China and Russia, but also because they were interested in preserving what they thought was a democracy in South Vietnam. Now, this is an aspect of the Cold War, full stop. This is what they were fighting, the Cold War. So in 1965, they begin to send a lot of troops. And what they quickly discover is that the fighting in South Vietnam is really not straightforward at all. It is what we would call today a kind of war of counterinsurgency. At the time, they called it a guerrilla war or a dirty war. There are essentially no big unit battles. There are some, but not very many. The North Vietnamese had infiltrated South Vietnam. They were really all over the place. They had set up a kind of shadow government in many parts of South Vietnam, in the area where My Lai occurred, which is Kwang Nai province in the north of South Vietnam on the coast. The Viet Cong essentially ruled the area. They had very significant sympathy among the local population. And the way the United States fought the war at the time was essentially like this, and it's still the way we fight wars of counterinsurgency. They set up kind of safe spaces, we would call them. They're fire bases. These are places that are heavily fortified with a lot of artillery, and then they would sally forth out of these fire bases in order to find the Viet Cong, if they could, which was often a problem, and defeat the Viet Cong. This is combined essentially with an effort to convince the local population that the Americans, in this case, on these South Vietnamese forces, and there were Korean forces there as well. There were also Australian forces, there were Canadian forces, that they were really there to help the South Vietnamese. This proved very difficult because, as you can understand, when somebody invades your country, you think, why are these people here? Who are they? What are they doing? They say they're here to help us, but they keep, they killed my uncle and they keep blowing things up. So this was a very tough sell, but that's essentially the way that they fought the war, from these fire bases. And so let's move forward to 1968. This is after the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive came as a great surprise to the United States. Westmoreland and his buddies had told the people of the United States that the war was going very well. In early 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched an offensive all over South Vietnam, including most famously the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They attacked it, and this shocked the hell out of the U.S. forces. Now, actually, the Tet Offensive went very badly for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. They came out into the open, and this is precisely what you do not want to do in a guerrilla war. They fought the Americans in what were kind of big stand-up battles. They lost. So in an oddly ironic sense, the Tet Offensive was a great victory for the North Vietnamese in terms of turning public opinion against the war, because they felt they'd been lied to by the chiefs of staffs and the president. But militarily, it was kind of a disaster for the North Vietnamese. And actually, there's some good books about this, because the North Vietnamese were really set on the back foot by how effective the Americans and the Koreans and the South Vietnamese were.
And they lost about, in the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese lost about, was it about 45,000?
I don't know the figure, and these figures are notoriously unreliable. They really, it's very difficult to say, because at this point, it's almost all propaganda. But we
because
historians
that
have
was
looked
the
at this.
prime motivation for the American forces, was to count the numbers of people they'd killed.
Yeah, and just to digress a little bit on body count, people criticize it a lot, but one wonders, how are you going to measure success in a war like this other than body count? You can't really measure it by the territory you control, because nominally you control all of it, right? There was no place the American forces could not go. Now, of course, they would suffer various predations if they went there, but they could go anywhere. So they already have all the territory. So how are you going to measure success? Well, how many of the enemy you kill seems like a pretty legitimate way to do it, even though it's come under a lot of criticism. I don't know if the military still does it this way or not, but yeah. So the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong got drubbed after the Tet Offensive, and there was renewed effort on the part of the Americans to try to bring the conflict to some sort of close. And this really brings us right to the cusp of what happened at My Lai.
So My Lai occurs within a few weeks of the offensive. There had been atrocities that had taken place before My Lai, by both sides, in fact. And so I know we're going to get into the whys and the wherefores in a moment, but My Lai really is an outlier, certainly for US troops, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I argue in the book that some people may or may not disagree with. Of course, it depends on what you mean by an atrocity. If you are a pacifist, all war is an atrocity. So the idea of war crime is a kind of nonsense because all war is a crime. Yes, there had been atrocities where civilians were killed on both sides. But again, this is what I argue in the book. There's nothing like My Lai that we find in the records. That is, simply in terms of the number of civilians who were killed and the way in which they were killed. They were killed by shooting. And you might argue reasonably that bombing North Vietnam, something my uncle did, actually. This is part of the reason I wrote the book. He piloted a fighter bomber during the Vietnam War, and he bombed North Vietnam, and he probably killed civilians. I mean, he may have killed hundreds of them. I don't know. And you might say, well, that's an atrocity. Well, okay, fair enough. But it wasn't done intentionally. In this case, it is somewhat different because it was really face-to-face killing. They gathered, we'll talk about this in a second, but they gathered a couple of groups of Vietnamese civilians together and they shot them. And the number of people killed is also really unknown. You see the figure 500 a lot. I don't know if that's true. It may be. The United States military says 128 were killed. I don't know.
That's the official. True. Is that an official?
Yes, that's the final report. They said 128 Vietnamese were killed. So we really don't know, but we don't see any atrocities on that scale of a face-to-face nature where U.S. troops in the field were shooting civilians. So in that sense, it's unique.
So why were US troops there? Was there a military objective that needed to be taken, or was it?
Yeah, well, the military reason was essentially to hold the line in this area of South Vietnam. It was it had always been a hotly contested area. It's pretty close to the North. The North always had people there. One of the things about the Vietnam War is that even though the United States at one point had 500,000 troops in the field, well, not in the field, but they had 500,000 military personnel there, they never had enough people to actually do the job they were assigned to do. And the unit that did the massacre was a unit that was simply kind of created out of whole cloth. It was called Task Force Barker, to hold the line in this coastal area of South Vietnam while other things were going on near the DMZ. And the DMZ was a very hotly contested area at this time. So essentially, it was kind of a holding action. They didn't want the North and the Viet Cong to make any more headroads than they had made. And of course, their ostensible option, and the option of the United States military even to this day, is to find, close with, and kill the enemy. And so that's what they were supposed to do. They were in a couple of fire bases. And I should also say, this is not an area of Vietnam that is jungle. It's a coastal area. It's pretty open, and it's very near the sea. And in fact, during the My Lai massacre, there were bombardments from the sea. So their American Navy was, kind of right off the shore. So it wasn't an area of emphasis for the United States Army, but it was an area that they felt that they had to devote a certain amount of attention to just to hold the line.
And so you mentioned the unit name there, Task Force Baker. What was the size and who were? That doesn't sound like a conventional name.
No, it's not. It's not actually. And what happened is that some Korean units that were in the area were ordered north. They had been holding this area in this particular area of operation, and Samuel Coster, who's the head of the Marical division, ordered a guy named Andy Lipscomb, who was the head of the 11th Brigade, to create some sort of unit that could hold the line in this area, the So Tonh district, or we just call it the My Lai district, or Pinkville is what they called it, because that's what it was called on U.S. maps. And so he puts together this ad hoc unit called Task Force Barker, named after the leader of the unit, who was Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker. And Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker becomes very important, and I think this has been missed in previous understandings of My Lai, some of which are very good, by the way. I want to make clear that mine is not a revisionist history. I build on what other people found. I really offer a kind of higher resolution understanding of what went on. But in my story, unlike previous stories, Colonel Frank Barker is really the person most responsible for the massacre. He's the person that kind of set it in motion. You hear a lot about Ernest Medina and William Calley. Most people know who William Calley is because he was prosecuted. These are, in my telling, they're not minor players, but they're not as important as Barker. So Barker was put in charge of this unit called Task Force Barker. It's a battalion-sized task force, meaning it has 3 companies and about 500 men. And all of these men are located on these fire bases where they can be safe, because you can't stay out in the countryside, you're not safe. And what they would do is they would leave these fire bases on patrols, some of which lasted days, in order to look for the VC. And so his mission was essentially to find what they thought was a particular VC unit, the 48th VC Battalion. This is the kind of bête noire of Task Force Barker. His hope was to find the 48th VC Battalion and destroy it.
So the 48th VC Battalion is going to be using villages for food, and so there will be a certain amount of involvement in the area, won't there? I mean,
the basic difficulty that many American commanders in Vietnam, and Barker included, was he didn't know where they were. It was very easy for them to hide. They could dissolve among the populace. They could go to the west into the highlands where the American presence was weaker. And so, one of his difficulties in accomplishing his mission was simply to find them. Now, this brings us to kind of the run-up to the My Lai massacre. Barker thought he knew where they were on 2 separate occasions, February 13th and February 23rd, 1968. And he thought they were in the Pinkville or My Lai area. And so twice before, he had mounted battalion-size operations, hundreds of men, to attack the area around My Lai. And if you read the reports, which I did, and anybody can, they look like great successes. He reports killing 155 VC for only 6 KIAs. Now, his peers and his superiors would have looked at this with some suspicion, because that ratio doesn't make sense. And the American forces were, in many ways, better than the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, but were they that much better? It's a very odd kill ratio.
I think Westmoreland gave a ratio of 10-1, didn't he?
He may have, I don't know, but I can tell you this, and this is something that's kind of missed in much of the popular imagination, or I guess popular understanding of the Vietnam War. The United States military was very concerned with civilian casualties. I read, and you can read, many, many memos and many investigations of very strange, what looked like the inflation of body counts. and it's easy to understand why they would be concerned with this. I mean, first of all, it was against the regs, right? I mean, most militaries have regulations against killing civilians, and it's bad for all kinds of reasons. But it was also bad for business in the sense that there were lots of reporters in the field who didn't like the Vietnam War who were looking for atrocities, and they would report them in the New Yorker and places like this, in the New York Times. So if they could be avoided, well, that was just much better. For everybody. And so the brass was pretty much all over people like Barker to avoid civilian casualties, if at all possible. And I don't have any evidence that they didn't do that. They did try to avoid civilian casualties, but in this context where you can't really tell very easily combatants from civilians, it's difficult. And these particular two operations, the February 13th and February 23rd ones, one wonders, how do you kill 155 VC, only suffer 6 casualties? And then the kicker is, in his report, he said they found only 6 weapons. Right. And so you might ask yourself, okay, if there were 155, at least 155 VC in the area, and you killed 155 of them, you only collected 6 weapons? Where are the weapons? And the brass asked this question all the time. When they got these reports, they were like, okay, this doesn't make sense. What are you doing? Well, it's pretty clear what they were doing, I think. They were inflating the body count to make themselves look better because, the other thing to understand is for people like Barker, they were always trying to make rank. Barker really wanted a real battalion, not Task Force Barker. He wanted a real battalion. And the best way to make rank is to do really well on the field. And so what they would do is they would essentially pad these reports. Now, the brass knew they were doing this. There's no question about it because the brass was all over them about it. But the 6 weapon things look really strange. And you can find this in the documents. And I should talk a little bit about why we know all this. Because after the My Lai Massacre in 1970, after it came out, the Army conducted the largest investigation of any military operation in history. It was called the Peers Commission. And they interviewed everybody involved. And that produced 18,000 pages of transcript interviews. They collected 5,000 official documents. So we know everything about this particular small unit action, battalion-sized action. And we know that Barker was questioned about it and people talked. They wondered. And the obvious thing that people wondered was, who were those? First of all, did he kill 155 VC? Well, maybe not. If he did kill 155 people, who were they?
So there may have been 2 previous atrocities. We just don't know.
There may have been. I argue in the book that there weren't 2 previous atrocities. And the reason is this. Had there been, the North Vietnamese would have used it in propaganda, which they did after My Lai in a big way. So I don't think that there were atrocities. Probably civilians were killed, but I don't think 155 were killed in these 2 previous incidents. Again, I could be wrong. I mean, it's always important to say I could be totally wrong about this, and there could have been 2 previous atrocities. I don't think there were. But people were asking questions about this. Like, what is Barker up to? What is he doing? The 155 doesn't make the 6 weapons doesn't make sense. What is going on? And you have to think about it you have to put yourself in Barker's shoes. This worried him. He wanted to make rank. He wanted to get a real battalion. He wanted to impress his superiors. And so what does he do? Well, he decides to go again into the same area. And this is how we get to the My Lai Massacre, which happens on March 16th, 3 weeks after the February 23rd incursion.
So 16th of March, we should make clear to listeners, the actual massacre that it didn't come out till much later to the American public.
Yeah, that's right. There was a cover up, and this is another thing that I don't deal with the cover up in the book, except to say that it started a lot earlier than people think, because it actually started on the day, and we can talk a little bit about that. I mean,
yeah,
and remind me to talk about that because it started literally 10 minutes after the initial assault. Yeah, there was a cover up, but it wasn't a cover up by the U.S. Army. It was a cover up by 4 or 5 bad actors and probably a dozen really inattentive senior officers who just weren't looking very carefully. But yeah, it was over a year before it finally came out.
Well, let's go into the massacre itself.
Right. So you kind of have to start on March 15th or a little bit before. So Barker is looking for the 48th VC. He doesn't know where they are. And so suddenly one of his intelligence officer, a guy named Katush, comes to him and says, I know exactly where they are. They're in a village called My Lai 4. There are several My Lais. They all have numbers on army maps. They're in My Lai 4. And they're in very fortified positions, and all of them are there, and I'm just sure of this. Later Army investigators tried to find out where that intelligence came from, and they could not. They looked at other intelligence shops. They questioned Katush himself. They questioned all the people, like, where did you get this information? Because it proved to be completely incorrect, like 100% wrong. And nobody could find out where it came from. Like, I don't want to say it was made up, but like nobody could trace the thread that led from whatever intelligence to Katush to Barker. Nobody could figure this out. It is rather suspicious because he's telling his boss what he wants to hear, right? Katush is saying to Barker, oh, I know exactly where they are. They're right here. And then he says something that's even more remarkable and really absurd. He says that on the morning of March 16th, there'll be no civilians in the village. None. And the reason he gives for this is that they will all be at market. That's true, that people do go to market. They have to buy stuff. It's totally true. But I feel comfortable in saying that both Barker and Katush knew this was absurd. And later Army investigators, when they were talking to Katush, Barker was dead, by the way. He died about a year after. He was killed in a helicopter crash about a year after, so he couldn't be questioned. So they asked Katush and other people, like, okay, where did you get this crazy idea? And many of these investigators had served in Vietnam in exactly the same positions that, Lipscomb and Barker and Medina and Cat, they had been there, and they knew this was crazy, that there's no way all the civilians leave any village for market on any particular day. It just can't happen. And of course, Katush says, well, this is based on my experience and things like this. Well, his experience told him this was false. So here you have what are essentially two bits of very bad intelligence. One, that the 48th VC is all in My Lai 4, and two, that all the civilians are gone. Now, I have to digress a little bit. Pardon me, though. After the February 13th and February 23rd operations, Barker became very concerned about civilian casualties. Suddenly, and everybody reports this, like suddenly he's really worried about it. And he even goes to the Vietnamese and says, could you please remove all the civilians from the My Lai Pinkville area? And you can see why he would do this, right? He wants a free hand. He doesn't want to have to worry about what we would call collateral damage. He doesn't want his soldiers coming into contact with Vietnamese civilians. Why doesn't he want that? Well, you have to digress a little bit further. In this area, I can't speak about Vietnam generally or South Vietnam generally. In this area, the soldiers themselves call almost all the civilians VC sympathizers. They don't call them civilians. And when later questioned about why they shot them, they said, because the interrogator would say, well, why did you shoot these civilians? And they would say, well, they weren't civilians. They were VC sympathizers. They all said this. I mean, and true, maybe they were covering their asses. I don't know. But my impression is that they were speaking genuinely, that they were really worried about these people, that these people were, in fact, in league with the Viet Cong. And they may have been. This is not incorrect, because when these soldiers went into these kind of rural areas outside their fire bases, what they found was mines and booby traps and sniper fire all the time, every time they went out. And so who's doing the shooting? Who's putting the mines? Who's laying the booby traps? Well, who's in the area? What's these people? And so they invent this concept, really, VC sympathizer. And so Barker, in the run-up to the March 16th operation, he's very worried about this. And who knows, maybe on February 13th and February 23rd, his guys had shot a bunch of quote-unquote VC sympathizers. He doesn't want that to happen again. He's tired of the stock. So he asked the South Vietnamese to remove all the civilians. And of course, the South Vietnamese said, well, that's just impossible. Part of the reason they couldn't do it is because they weren't really in the area, because the VC controlled it. I mean, it's another thing people, it shocked me when I learned it. Like, South Vietnamese officials would not go into this area. because they knew that the VC was in control of it. They had a shadow government there. It was, the Americans called it Indian country. For the South Vietnamese officials, that is people who were in league with Saigon, this was just no-go area. You were, a bad thing was going to happen to you if you went into that area. And so the South Vietnamese tell Barker, well, we can't do that. We can't even go there. But Barker decides to proceed anyway on the basis of these two bits of completely fallacious intelligence, one of which was that the 48th VC Battalion was in a fortress in My Lai 4 and that there would be no civilians there. And that's what he tells his commanders. There's briefings on March 15th where he says to his captains, that is the people in charge of the companies, look, we're attacking a VC fortress. There are going to be no civilians there. You essentially should kill everybody you see and destroy everything you find, just like you would be attacking a military installation, because that's what this is. Why he said this, I don't know. Whether he believed it, I don't know. Everything he did suggests he did believe it. For example, he ordered an artillery strike on the village itself. This is something the United States Army tried to avoid at all costs, and goes back to something they don't want civilian casualties. You do not bombard a village. Well, you have to go way up the chain of command to get an allowance to do that. Barker did not go way up the chain of command to get that, but he actually shelled the village. So it suggested he actually did believe this.
Did he have artillery himself, or did he call?
Well, he had attached artillery. Yeah, he had attached artillery from the fire bases they flew out of. There were 2 fire bases they flew out of, and he had attached artillery, so he could order a strike. So this brings us, and it's important to understand exactly what the captains in charge of the companies, what the platoon leaders themselves were told. They were told that this was a VC fortress and there would be no Vietnamese in it. So they should go and kill everybody they saw and destroy everything. And this primed them. They had been waiting for a big stand-up fight for a long time. Fighting in Vietnam was frustrating, right? Snipers and mines and booby traps and no contact with the enemy. Here was an instance in which it was clear there were them and there's us, and we have a free hand to go in and kill them and put an end to this. And I think this is the way that they thought of it. Now, of course, they were scared, obviously, because this was the first time they were going to be involved in a kind of unit-on-unit engagement, as opposed to ordinary counterinsurgency or guerrilla warfare. So on the morning of March 16th at 8 a.m., they landed outside My Lai 4. And we're going to concentrate. The operation is a little bit more complicated than that. There were a couple of other villages involved, but let's just concentrate on My Lai 4. So the company involved there is under the command of Ernest Medina. He was a seasoned officer, also a career officer. He knew what he was doing. He had been highly decorated. And all of these people were like that. I mean, they were all seasoned officers. They weren't newbies by any standard. Go ahead.
And it wasn't a group that was lacking in morale, having been in Vietnam for many years. Well, they have a year-long tours, don't they? But
I mean, but Barker had been in Vietnam for years. And the thing about it is for career officers, they wanted to get back to Vietnam because that's where you made your career. This is something that's always forgotten. You do not make your career sitting at a desk in Fort Leavenworth. You make your career fighting in the field in Vietnam. So for people like Barker and Medina, this is where they wanted to be, right? Because that's where you show yourself to your superiors, and that's how you get a good fitness report, and that's how you get promoted. And that's what they wanted. So on the morning of March 16th, they land outside My Lai 4. Everybody seems to be saying that it's a VC fortress, that there should be several hundred VC in it in fortified positions. The place is shelled. They get there and there's nothing. Now you would expect a kind of fusillade, right, out of the village. And they didn't land very far away. It was like 100 meters. And in terms of weapons, if it was actually a battalion, they would have had 51 caliber, the equivalent of an American Browning 50 caliber machine gun. And that would have been able to tear up the helicopter, but they did nothing. There's no firing from the village. There were helicopter gunships that did see VC in the area. This is another kind of myth of My Lai. There were actually VC in the area. There's no question about it. the helicopter gunships saw them, took them under fire, and they were found, and they were armed, and they captured their weapons. But the 48th VC was not there, or at least it didn't look like they were there. And so this was very confusing for both Barker and Medina and then later Cali. Like they get there, they're in position outside the village, waiting for instructions, and there's no fire coming from the village. There's a lot of fire because helicopter gunships are involved. There was artillery coming in. There was no fire from the village. Now, I suppose if you want to, Monday morning quarterback it, that should have been it. It should have ended right there, right? Barker should have said, okay, we were wrong. He should have told Medina, we're done. We're going to move around this village, and we're going to go to our next objective. And this wouldn't have been an unusual thing to do because intelligence is wrong a lot. But that's not what Barker did. Barker said, go ahead with the assault as if it was a VC fortress. So they go in firing. And here I have to digress a little bit more. I'm sorry for all these digressions. One of the things that the troops in Vietnam in this area learned to do was called reconnaissance by fire. The purpose of reconnaissance by fire is to fire blindly into areas where you think the enemy is in hopes that they will return fire and thereby reveal their position. Lots of militaries do this. It's very common. I mean, you need to find the bad guys. How are you going to do it? Well, shoot at them and they'll probably shoot back. And the troops go on and on about how great reconnaissance by fire is because the Vietnamese generally shoot back. And that's bad fire control, but in any event. So they basically went into the village shooting. Now, who did they see? Well, they saw a lot of people. Who they were, they didn't know. Barker and Medina were hoping that the 48th VC was actually in the village exercising incredible fire control. They were not firing. This was still possible. Like they're
sort
of really
waiting
good.
Till the
man.
whites of the eyes.
Yeah, exactly. They're really good. They're that good. So they go in firing, and they, in about a 10 or 15 minute period, they shoot a lot of people, which turn out to be civilians. And then they finally get into the village, and it's very clear at that point that there are no VC in this village, or at least if there are, they're hiding. And again, that's another point at which, again, Monday morning quarterback, that should have been it. We're done now. And in a way, it was. Now, Medina, who was the head of a C company that had assaulted My Lai 4, he issues a report, and this is where the cover-up starts, that says he's already killed 20-some VC. He knew they weren't VC. I mean, we have it in the record. He radios back these reports. Yeah, contact made. We killed 20 VC. I got the bodies, so on and so forth, and we're going to proceed through the village. So he's already lying. And Barker already knows there's something just not right about it. I mean, it clearly isn't what they expected. So at this point, Medina and Barker and a couple of other people start to collude, essentially to hide what's going on. And we're only 10 minutes into the operation. It's like 8:15. At that point, Medina says, okay, hold your fire. Let's gather the civilians up into groups and get them out of the village so we can move through the village because we have another objective past the village. And so that's what he orders Cali to do. Get them into groups, get them out of the village. We'll search the village, and then we'll move on to our next objective, which is to the north. And Cali does this. And then something really inexplicable happens. Well, let me actually go back a little bit. When they made the initial assault, and we had this from the testimony of soldiers involved, some of the soldiers involved said they knew they weren't VC. They didn't fire. At least that's what they say. They said, I did not fire because I knew these weren't bad guys. Right? Others did. And, fire is kind of contagion. The best way to know that you should be firing is if the guy next to you is firing. And so all of a sudden, everybody's firing, and you're like, well, I should be firing. Some of them didn't, though, or at least they claim they didn't. So Barker tells Medina to round these groups up, and we know he rounded up at least 2 groups of people. And as I say, then something inexplicable happened a few minutes later. Cali orders his men to kill the civilians in these groups. And why did he do this? Well, we don't know exactly. What Callie says is that Medina was telling him to get through the village as quickly as possible because they have another objective. And clearly the VC aren't here, and we have to get to our next objective. So we need to get through this village. And Medina tells Callie to take care of, I think he uses those words exactly, take care of these, what he would have thought were VC sympathizers. And Callie orders his men to kill them in at least two groups. And this is also interesting because some of the soldiers agree to do it, but many of them don't. Many of them say, no, I'm sorry, I cannot be involved in this. I will not shoot these people. And they just walk off. And, in the testimony, again, there are 18,000 pages. They talk about this. They're like, yeah, I saw what they were doing and I wasn't going to have anything to do with it. So I walked away. Now, maybe they are lying. I don't know. But it clearly would have strained the conscience of these people to be killing civilians. They knew they weren't supposed to be killing civilians. This is not a debatable point. They knew that. So some of them do, some of them don't, but enough of them do that some number of civilians were killed in these groups. And then they take the village completely, they burn it, they round up the remaining civilians and send them on their way. Now, what Callie says is that he shot them because they couldn't be left in the rear. And there's a certain military sense to this. Like, imagine you really do think they are VC sympathizers, and in fact, they have an arms cache underneath their house or something. You're not just going to leave them there, right, and proceed, north to your next objective. Something has to be done, and you can't take them with you. So what do? Well, you don't shoot them. But that's what Callie did.
I was wondering what standard procedure would be. Presumably, you would blow up the guns and you'd tie them up or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, there were no guns found. Well, I don't know if there were any guns found. I don't really recall. But they didn't find any arm caches in My Lai or anything like that. I don't know what they would have done. And this is why it's so mysterious, because I think standard procedure in that case would have been to leave them in the village and just move on. But Callie says that he felt, and Medina felt, that they could not be left in the rear because they pose a danger to the troops who were going north. That's what he says. What happened, I don't know. A lot of people have some strange theories about why Callie did what he did. One of which is that that he felt Medina kind of bullied him, and he wanted to show Medina that he was a tough guy. This is not true. I can tell you this is not true. Medina bullied all of his platoon commanders, all of them. And they say this. He didn't treat Callie any different than anybody else. It's a theory. It's just not a plausible theory given what we know about the way Medina handled his platoon commanders. And we also know that other platoon commanders did not do this. He had two other platoon commanders. They did not kill civilians. Well, their soldiers in one case did kill some civilians. And there were some rapes that occurred in a village which is kind of next to My Lai, where they felt the VC might be. They went to that village. It's called Binte, and there were several rapes committed there, which were stopped immediately. Once the commander of that platoon found out, a guy named Michaels, he stopped it immediately. I mean, clearly that's not on.
And My Lai, no rapes at My Lai?
No rapes that we know at My Lai, but at Binte definitely. Now that doesn't mean they didn't occur.
No, but none.
And the men and their testimony were remarkably forthcoming about this. That they were very willing to say, yeah, he did it. He was known to do it. They could identify good actors and bad actors within the platoon and within the company. They would say, like, yeah, this guy was crazy. He definitely, he was out to kill Vietnamese, and this guy was a rapist. I mean, we had their names. We know who they were. They were not shy about pointing the fingers at their peers and saying, yeah, this guy was a bad actor. And he did it. Then within a couple of hours, they're clear of the village.
Okay, so they've left the village, left these. I mean, they didn't kill everyone in the village of My Lai, did they?
No.
What was the population of My Lai?
Well, that's a hotly contested topic. I don't know. several hundred, I would say.
So the figure of 500 killed at My Lai, I know that's a figure that's bandied around. It's very difficult to know if that's right or not. That sounds like that's more than the
I
population.
don't know. I really, and in a certain way,
They don't carry out census to
no,
establish.
no. And remember, this is North Vietnam. Well, it's Vietnam. It's Viet Cong controlled area, so we don't know. And this is obviously very valuable propaganda for the North Vietnamese, which they use. I'm sort of two minds about this debates over this figure. First of all, it doesn't matter. One is too many. They should not have been doing that. They should not have killed these people, whether they were VC sympathizers or not. And then I would say that we just don't know. I mean, we know what the North Vietnamese said. We know what the U.S. Army said. But to me, it's just. I guess it's an interesting question in ways, but again, one is.
It's not the point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the point. Yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned.
I was going to say we kind of know it was a lot because there were photographs that were taken. The Army had attached a photographer to the unit because they thought they were going to have a great victory, and so we see groups of bodies, and it's a lot.
Okay. So you mentioned that the cover-up begins immediately, and we've already heard a little bit of that as well. And it
proceeds along. It proceeds along the. Again, they're covering things up along the way. They're issuing reports, which they go to what's called the talk. They issue these reports saying, we killed this many people, we captured this many weapons, we did this, we're moving here. And interestingly, there's also a recording of what went on in the talk. Tactical Operation Command, I think it's called. I don't really remember. But there's a recording. Somebody decided to record it because it was a big day for them. And so we actually have a recording of these reports being phoned in. And we have a recording of all the radio traffic, which is a great source. And what it basically shows is that very early on, within 15
so you
minutes,
get to. Sorry to interrupt you there, Marshall, but you're listening to these. These are in archives, and you're.
I didn't get to listen to them, but I got transcripts of them because the Peers Commission had them all transcribed. But yeah, I mean, what you see is that everybody knew within about 15 or 20 minutes that there was something deeply wrong with this. And at that point, they were all trying to cover their asses.
And how high up?
Well, it probably goes to a guy named Orrin Henderson, who was in charge of the 11th Brigade. He was in the air at the time. So you have Orrin Henderson. He was the new commander of the 11th Brigade. Then you have Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker. He knew. Medina knew. Cali knew. All of the soldiers who were involved knew. But it's the higher ups that issue the reports. And so they start issuing these reports back to the TOC and back to battalion saying, oh yeah, we killed this many VC and so on and so forth. So at this point, they're just engaged in a cover up. And this happens like during the event.
So you mentioned, I think it's Colonel Henderson.
Yeah.
Who seems to be the most, is he the most senior commander who
he's the most senior in the area.
Knows what's happened.
There's a guy above him named Coster. And eventually, within a few hours, the word goes from Medina to Barker to Henderson to Coster. Coster is the head of the Americal Division, which is the big unit in the area. And Coster gets reports, and this is kind of well known because a guy named Hugh Thompson, he saw it happen. He was a helicopter pilot. And he famously sort of threw the red flag and said, look, there are civilians being shot down here. And he even saved some of them. And so it goes from this air unit, which is a helicopter unit, to Barker, then to Henderson, then to Coster. Coster gets wind of it within a few hours that something has gone wrong at My Lai. And I don't deal with this in the book because this is really part of the cover-up. What happens is, if I recall correctly, Henderson says, just on the basis of the suspicions which have been raised, we need to go back to that village to see what happened. Now, remember, they have other objectives. Medina doesn't want to do this. Barker doesn't want to do this. We need to go back to this village. And so Henderson says, and he's the new commander. He didn't design this operation. It was his predecessor, a guy named Lipscomb. But he's like, something is wrong here. We need to go back to that village and get a good count and see what actually is going on because it doesn't look kosher to me. And then, remarkably, as they're about to be ordered to turn around and go in, this is in the afternoon, Coster, who's the head of the Americal division, says, don't do it. Don't go back to that village. And there's been a lot of speculation as to whether Coster was trying to cover something up or something. It doesn't look like that's the case. Coster said, we don't want to go back to that village, first of all, because we have other objectives. We need to find the 48th VC. And second of all, we don't know what's back there. For all we know, it's laden with booby traps and mines and everything else. And just in terms of force protection, we do not want to go back to that village. So proceed. So Henderson's order is countermanded. And that was just luck for the later conspirators, that is, the people that actually covered it up, Barker and Medina. Just blind luck that Coster did this. And for reasons which had to do with, military exigency, not with wanting to cover anything up. He's just like, look, no, we are not going backwards. We're going forwards. Our next objective is this, go there.
So if we deal with the why it happened, and I know we've talked about it to a great extent, you've given sort of tactically on the ground the reasons of why it happened. Those reasons being they were bad actors on the ground and incompetence.
I think the simplest explanation for why this happened, again, you could probably name it's a little bit like the French Revolution. Why did the French Revolution happen? 100 reasons, and you could probably give 100 reasons. But the most forceful explanation in my mind is that these troops were badly led. And they were badly led by Barker. He is the person most at fault for this. He believed things which were at best dubious, and at least in one case, no civilians there, absolutely preposterous. And he ordered his men to go in and kill everyone and destroy everything. Now, it's interesting to note that they didn't exactly do that. He told them to, but they didn't do it. They got there, they saw that the VC wasn't there, and they didn't destroy and kill everything. They killed some civilians, or as they would say, VC sympathizers. They killed some of them in groups, which is incomprehensible. They destroyed the village, which they were told to do, but they didn't kill everybody. But it's really Barker and the way that he framed the operation itself as an attack on a heavily fortified VC fortress. That primed the men. They really expected a stand-up fight where they might be killed. They were very concerned about this, obviously. And so, they saw what they wanted to see, or they saw what they had told to, what they were told to expect.
Lieutenant Calley, I think, is the only soldier to have been convicted for the crimes.
That is correct. Medina was charged and acquitted, and Calley was found guilty of the murder of, I think, 23 Vietnamese civilians.
And Barker died before it even came out.
Barker died a little over a year in a helicopter accident in country. Yeah, so we don't really know. We couldn't question him. But Henderson and Coster and everybody else involved was questioned in detail. And there's also a failure of oversight, because we know that this particular operation was not approved by Lipscomb or Henderson or Coster. They didn't know anything about it. And, in a way, that's not a bad thing. You want your commanders to have a certain amount of, license in the field. Like they know the situation, and that's good. But ordinarily in an operation of this size, a battalion level operation, it would have to go up the chain of command. It did not. This was entirely Barker's doing. Soup to nuts. It was his deal.
So, Marshall, a lot of people listening would have watched the movies, maybe delved into it a little bit more, read some books. Recently, we had a very good Ken Burns documentary came out in a few years ago, and that would have certainly. I may be just speaking for me, but I think many people may agree is that by March the 16th, 1968, the war was not going well, and that many of the troops in the United States Army knew that the war wasn't going well. And generally, and I know we've talked about the morale aspect of it, but generally all these factors would have sort of built up in soldiers to to have almost, and they would have dehumanized their enemy and the civilians, particularly if they're sympathetic to the Viet Cong. So those factors surely should be taken into account when we try and apportion blame.
Well, I mean, I think they should, but if, and this is something that I point out in the book, if all those factors were very powerful, then you'd see lots of My Lais. But we don't. There's only one incident like this that I have found in the record, because these factors obtained everywhere in South Vietnam. So if they were the causal element, then there would be 20 My Lais or 30 or 40, but there weren't. It was one. Now, I don't have any doubt that these things mattered. It's also interesting to know if you ask the people that questioned the soldiers, asked them what they thought about the Vietnamese, and they just generally said they liked them. I don't know what, maybe they were just covering their asses, but yeah, they were very harsh on what they called VC sympathizers, but they said they generally liked the Vietnamese, that they were fine people. Again, I think in order to understand what happened here, you really have to focus on Barker's ambition. He really wanted to show his superiors that he was worthy of a promotion and a real battalion. And to do that, he had to destroy the 48th VC. So he saw what he wanted to see. And what he wanted to see was the VC without any civilians in a fortified village that he could destroy. So I guess I'm, in my account, it's more about particulars than generalities.
So the My Lai Massacre, what's the legacy of that today in the US Army? I mean, I know, we've seen...
I don't know. I mean, I could say this. We still fight wars of counterinsurgency in almost exactly the same way. We build fire bases. We send troops out of those fire bases to try to find the counterinsurgents. We try to kill them and make fine distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. And we try to convince the population that we're there to help them. We did this in Iraq. We did it in Afghanistan. We're doing it today in Syria. I don't see how this can work. This is more editorial than anything else, me not speaking as a historian anymore. But
no, sure.
If you invade somebody's country, they're not going to want you there. And yeah, they may not be communists or jihadists or whatever, but they're going to be like, who are you? Why are you here? What? You're here to help me, but you killed my uncle. I just don't. And this is why in the book I talk about the Vietnam War as a war of occupation, not a war of counterinsurgency. Because what we did was we occupied South Vietnam. We didn't really control it. We occupied it. And we said we were there to search for counterinsurgents, but we had pissed the entire population off, or at least a very good portion of them. And I think you see this again and again whenever a big state tries to take control of a smaller state or nation, invades, and then the locals are not happy about you being there. They may like their neighbors, they may not like their neighbors, but they don't like you because you're there with a gun and you killed their uncle. And so it's a very tough go. I really, and I learned it's actually interesting how I kind of came to frame this as a war of occupation versus a counterinsurgency operation, is that there's a remarkable book called Soldaten. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. But what happened was the British captured all these Germans during the war, and they put them in camps, and then they recorded their conversations. And so there are zillions of hours of these German soldiers who were posted to France and Poland and Czechoslovakia and these other places, talking about what they did. And, for all the world, it sounds like Vietnam. You're like, yeah, the people around here hate us. And, it's really hard to go anywhere. It's I'm safe in my base, but I can't, if I leave, it's dangerous. And, it's just like people hate us. And, it's very rough to be here. And I was like, one hesitates to make comparisons between, Americans and Nazi Germans, but the situation is kind of the same. You're in somebody else's country and you're trying to convince them that you're there for their own good, but you killed their uncle. And it just is it's a tough go.
It's really interesting you saying that, particularly since just a few weeks ago on the podcast, we had General Petraeus join to talk about counterinsurgency. And obviously he's had, one could argue, success in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it ended in ultimate failure because you can have a sort of, I guess, successful counterinsurgency, but as you say, if you're an occupying power, the overall sentiment of the people is they want you out.
And eventually you're going to leave.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where they end.
Yeah, they know you're going to leave. Yeah.
They know you're going to leave. And you know, the Vietnamese just went on about this forever. Like, we know you're going to go. We just don't know when, but you're going to go. And they kind of want you to go. And that's the way these things have ended, at least for the United States. I can't speak, you know, the Malaysian experience, I don't know much about it, but in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, now in Syria, we're going to leave.
Well, I think Malaya and Borneo were quite successful, but they're very different examples. And I could list many British failures in foreign war.
Yeah, I don't know. Or you might think about the French war in Algeria.
Yeah, of course, yes.
They had to leave. I mean, they couldnn stay. And
French in Vietnam as well, of course.
Well, right, the French in Vietnam. I mean, it's just, kind of one of the general and interesting rules of modern military history is you cannot occupy a country in the long term. You cannot do it. The locals will want you out, and nationalism is strong enough. And if they're armed, they will get you out. You will get tired of it, and you will go home. And that's what happened in Vietnam twice. The French and with us.
I guess the only one I can think of is you could occupy Germany in the wake of the Second World War, but then I suppose the German civilians.
Yeah, but that's it's a kind of a different case in the sense that we had to absolutely, in Germany and Japan, we had to destroy those countries. We bombed their cities into rubble, and it's just a very different thing. I mean, I'm sure you could argue, well, no half measures. We should have bombed South Vietnam into rubble. And we could have done that, but no modern power is going to do that. We're just on humanitarian grounds. We're not going to do it. We're going to go in and we're going to say we're fighting a very clever war of counterinsurgency. Look how clever we are. We're going to find the bad guys. We're going to kill them, and then everything's going to be hunky dory. Well, that just has never worked, as far as I can tell. Because the bad guys are, from your perspective, almost everybody, because they don't want you there. They want you to go home. And that was the case in Vietnam, where they make this very interesting distinction between VC and VC sympathizer. It's like all the soldiers talk about it. They have nothing against the Vietnamese. They really don't. They just want to go home. I mean, that's another important thing to bear in mind, is that for the soldiers, they just want to go home. They want to serve their 1 year or 1 year, 2 month, their Marines stint and go home. Officers want to make rank. Like, they want to go find these people and kill them, because that's how they get promoted. So, you're kind of set up to, it's a dangerous situation. And for the grunts in the field, they're not going to make fine distinctions. Just as a matter of survival, they're just not going to make them. They're going to be told to make them right and left, but when push comes to shove, they're not going to be terribly interested in it, because they want to go home.
Yeah. Marshall, this has been fantastic. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, and is actually the reason why we're speaking, I think, is through your New Books Network, which you set up. You were telling me before we started recording as way back as 2007.
Yeah, 2007. Yeah, I can talk. We've already. I've taken up too much of your time already.
No. I
on these things, and
is it okay?
It's fine. Yeah, absolutely fine. So yeah, the New Books Network. I started it in 2007, and the idea was, this is kind of at the beginning of podcasting. The idea was to see whether people were interested in listening to professors talk about their books. That was all. And I thought this would be a good thing, because one of the problems all academics will tell you is that we write these books, and I've written them myself, and then crickets. Just nothing happens. They're not interviewed. There's a review that comes out 2 years later in an obscure journal, and that's it. You're done. Well, it seems to me there's a lot of lost value here, because these people actually know a lot. So I started to interview them in 2007, back when I was a professor, and to see if people would listen, and they did. And I was quite gratified by that. And it turns out it wasn't terribly difficult to do. So I originally, the New Books Network was just New Books in History, one channel. And then essentially what happened is word got out that I was doing this, and other academics contacted me and they said, well, why isn't there new books in anthropology? Why isn't there new books in South Asian studies? Why is, and I said to them, yeah, great. I'll set it up. You pick the books and do the interviews, and I'll do all the audio editing and I'll publish them, and we'll see what happens. And then we just started to launch new channels one after another. And in over 10 years ago now, I quit my job as a professor to do it full time, which, I don't know whether that was a good idea or not. And then, as I like to say, I wandered in the desert like a biblical prophet because there was no money in it. I was funding it entirely myself. But we built a really big audience, and we started to produce a lot of interviews. And eventually, we found a way to make the organization pay for itself. And now we sort of think of ourselves as a library. If you go to the New Books Network website, you'll see 24,000 episodes. So it pretty much everything you want is there. Like you'll find something that you're interested in. And it's a little bit Wikipedia-like in the sense that it caters to almost every interest. We don't differentiate between obscure topics and non-obscure topics. We just do all topics. Because from the point of view of the people who, write, these what we might think of as obscure, but they're not obscure. They're important. And so, we publish 70 new interviews a week. We only have about 1,000 hosts. They're almost all professors. And they do this work because they're interested in talking to their colleagues about their books. And, we're a very small organization. There are just 3 of us. And, we're a public education organization. That's what we do. Our mission is public education and nothing else. And so, I hope people will visit, and anybody's interested in becoming a host, if you're a professor or a graduate student, we'd love to have you. It's easy and fun. You get some free books.
Well,
we reach, I should also say we reach about we do about 1.5 million downloads. And we reach about 1 million people a month worldwide. And so, it's been gratifying to do this, I have to say.
That's pretty amazing. Who's going to interview you about this book?
I don't know. I don't know exactly.
You can pick the best. You can pick the best interviewer. The one.
Yeah, I suppose I could. Yeah, I haven't really thought about that yet.
Well, I hope
what I do all day is edit audio for other people, and that's I haven't really thought about it very much. But it took me a very long time to write this book, over 10 years, because I did it in little bitty pieces because I was running the New Books Network full time. So it was it's gratifying to see it in print. I don't know who's going to interview me. I have to figure that out.
Well, there are links in the show notes for listeners to follow up on, and I echo what you were saying. I mean, it's just you can get lost in there. There's so much to cover.
That's what we want. That's what we want. We it's a public education project, and we want people to listen to what these people. And the other thing about the New Books Network is a little bit different than Wikipedia is that we always give you someplace else to go. If you listen to the author talk about the book and you're really interested, you can read the book.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to get listeners to do here as well. So
yeah,
I think I would encourage. I mean, the Vietnam War I find endlessly fascinating, and what I find even more fascinating is that the My Lai Massacre is not really being explored as much as perhaps it could have been. But now we have your book, so that's an important
Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope that people. It's not really the kind of book you enjoy.
Yeah, it's grim reading.
Yeah, it's grim reading. Yeah, it's grim reading.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks very much, Marshall.
Absolutely.
Well, your organization very kindly contacted me, Richard and Kim own.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
they must have been running low on guests because they
I don't think so. But they're always interested in people doing interesting things. So that's how I met Richard. Actually, Richard Lucas is that he was like, "Look at this crazy thing you're doing."
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic, and the fact that you've been going for a while, and also before iPhones even existed, I suppose.
When I first started to do this, I would use Skype to call people's cell phones to interview them.
And then how did listeners, would they play them on the website?
No, they played them. Apple deserves a lot of credit for kind of creating the podcast. They had the first podcast app. And so the people at the Apple corporations deserve a lot of credit for creating the podcast market. And so originally there was just Apple, and there was a company called Stitcher. Stitcher recently went out of business, but they were great, early app. And so then it became easier and easier to get. Then Spotify got in the game, and so on and so forth. And then there are lots of podcast apps.
Yeah, yeah. Great stuff, Marshall. Well, look, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for listening. I've put links discussed in the show notes, including a breakdown of massacres in Vietnam for context, as Marshall and I discussed, as well as a link to Marshall's book and the New Books Network, and more info on that Ken Burns documentary, The Vietnam War. Plenty more great history to come, but until then, thank you and good night.